Hello everyone, welcome back to The Struggle, where we dive into the limits that bind us and the struggles that set us free. This is episode 48, and it's a special guest episode. Today, I'm joined by George from the TheTinMen blog and Instagram page. He's a content creator, a pro-men's advocate, and a researcher. In our conversation, we explore why men and women aren't actually oppressed, discuss the reasons behind why boys and men are moving to the political right, and how the left may be partly to blame for this shift. We also unpack how capitalism, whilst flawed, sometimes works in favours of both men and women, and dive into an extremely controversial topic in the UK. Why it's legally impossible for a woman to rape a man. And we also discuss much more. There's clearly a lot to cover in this episode, so get ready for an incredibly eye-opening episode. But first, this episode is brought to you by The Struggle newsletter. This is a fortnightly newsletter that complements the podcast nicely, in which I send out every other Sunday a short article concerning the art of embracing struggle. We are all restricted in some way, and we could all do with struggling to break free from whatever restricts us. The struggle is different for everyone, but I can assure you the Struggle newsletter and this podcast will help you discover what it is that is restricting you and how you can best struggle to break free from that restriction. If you're finding it difficult to be more productive, to be healthy, to achieve your goals, perhaps you're chasing the wrong thing. Because a lot of us believe that we should be aiming for happiness, but this is an unwise pursuit because happiness comes and goes without any control from us. However, there is a way to be more fulfilled with life, and that is to embrace the struggle. Maybe it's exercising for you, maybe it's being healthy, maybe it's having uncomfortable conversations, maybe it's taking a career risk, maybe it's discovering who you are, paying attention to your feelings, or to be autonomous. And that's why I created a newsletter, to help you discover where you could be struggling more and where you could become more fulfilled. Along with the article, I also provide tips, strategies, and recommendations such as podcasts, movies, music, and recipes to help along the way. So to sign up completely for free, go to gregorthomson.com, the link will be in the show notes, confirm your subscription, and then check your spam folder for your welcome newsletter, and then add me to your contacts to continue to receive it in your inbox for free. And that's it. You're on your way to productively struggling more and being more healthy, motivated, and fulfilled. Now, let's get on with the struggle. So, I thought we'd just start, first of all, with who are you and what is the TheTinMen?
Oh, good question. I'm George. I run a blog called TheTinMen, and TheTinMen is a lot of things, but I guess generally speaking, TheTinMen speaks about gender equality in the political space and is my best attempt to fill in all the missing gaps that men and boys are falling down. So a lot of the issues that, like domestic violence, doesn't really discuss men and boys, or sexual abuse certainly doesn't discuss men and boys. Things like prison reform, homelessness, drug addiction, obviously male suicide is important. Boys being behind in education, workplace death, early death, men's health generally speaking, all really important issues where when I started the account, I saw nothing. Now there's more, but it's still a dearth of well-meaning conversation, I think, in that area. So TinMen is my pro bono attempt to correct that and try my best to bring men and boys into the conversation of gender equality. So I guess we'll go into detail, perhaps, about what those things are. But I just felt it necessary. As someone on the left, and as a former feminist, I just felt the conversation around men and boys is not accurate, and I think I could do better. And people people quite literally told me to do it. If I would ask people questions about why are we not talking about male victims of abuse, people would say, this isn't about you, go set up your own page. And there's only so many times someone can tell you that this isn't for you, go sit. And I'm like, okay, I will. So in 2020, I set up the TinMen. 5 years later, wow. And now we're here.
And so you said they're former feminists. Why former?
I mean, generally, I mean, top line, I just didn't understand what feminism was adding. Like, I can still care about women, I can still love women, I can still want to empower women and be an advocate for women's rights and, be pro-choice and be horrified about what's happening to women all over the world and not be a feminist. I don't understand why do I love women. I love supporting women. I have so many important women in my life, and the things that they go through, I witness and I understand as much as I can as a man, I think. And it was important to me, but I didn't buy into the idea that men are part of some oppressive, that tyrannical oppressor class of men. I didn't think that was right. I found it dehumanizing. And it wasn't how we speak about women. It was more about how we speak about men I found unhelpful. Like I said, I agree there are significant issues that women face and we should talk about them, but I don't know why we have to continually deride and vilify and fearmonger around men in such a disproportionate way. So I just left it. But I continue to care about women, of course. I mean, women still as important as they've ever been to me.
And so, on that topic, it's probably worth. This is what I always preface conversations, or probably unnecessarily, but any conversation that has to do with men's issues or men's rights, I always feel like I have to preface this by saying this isn't exclusive. This isn't saying men are oppressed and women aren't, or that we don't care about women's issues, because it always seems like the backlash is, well, you don't even care about women's issues, or people assume that the topics are exclusive.
I don't think women are oppressed, not in the West. I mean, of course, women in Afghanistan are oppressed. Women in Iran are oppressed. Women in the UK are not oppressed. Women in America are not oppressed. I mean, I understand in terms of like bodily autonomy, there's argument for there, but you're not oppressed. I grew up. My mum grew up in Zimbabwe, and she witnessed what happened to Robert Mugabe, and she told me from a very early age what real oppression looks like. And we should be grateful we live in this country, men and women. I don't think men are oppressed either, by the way. I've never used the word oppressed to describe men in the UK. There are certainly men that are oppressed all over the world, as well as women, but I feel like deeply inappropriate to use that word. I feel like it minimizes what our ancestors, especially women, have gone through, which was real oppression. And I feel like it diminishes the progress of women. I was talking to my girlfriend about this just an hour ago on a dog walk, and she used to be a feminist too. And she was like, as soon as I stopped seeing the world as patriarchal, trying to oppress me, I've never felt happy. I've never felt more empowered. I've never felt freer. So I guess I'd argue that does the idea of the patriarchy as a is that oppressing women through fear, being told that you're being oppressed every single day by your male peers and family, friends, colleagues. They're being told that, is that oppressive? The fear from that. So I take the word oppression out of my vernacular completely, unless we're talking about the past or unless we're talking about certain parts of the world. But 2025, if you're a woman or a man in the UK, you're not oppressed.
Do you think it's more useful when talking about oppression to talk about class rather than gender or
Yes.
sex?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I also left the Labour Party. So any viewers that might not be aware, the Labour Party are in power, but they are left-wing party supposedly. And I left for the same reason. I thought the Labour Party was talking about class issues primarily, and it isn't. Not interested in class-based issues. It's only interested seemingly on identity politics. So race and women and gender and sexuality, which are important as well. But I'd say the biggest divide is still class. And like the difference in class is crazy, especially when it compounds with gender. So if you just an example, if you were to take a woman from Kensington, which is the most affluent part of the UK, and you would take a man from Blackpool, which is one of the least affluent, the poorest parts of the UK, the difference in life expectancy is about 15 years. And like, you will not find a 15-year age gap between any race or any gender or any sexuality. That is huge class-based and gender-based disparity. So really, really important. And also like in America, for example, and this is controversial to say, but no less true, but if you normalize by race, the class divide's gotten worse. And if you normalize by class, the racial divide's gotten better. So there's a lot not being said. And I would love to talk more about class, but it's just so many gaps, not enough time to talk about them. But absolutely. And I try to I try to be mindful of that in my work. I want to talk about men of working class, of lower socioeconomic groups, especially, because I think I learned a lot, but I don't want to make the same mistakes that I've seen from the progressive left myself.
Do you think capitalism perhaps plays a part here any sort of men suffering as well as women suffering. I've heard that argument a lot, that capitalism doesn't work for men as well as women. Something I'm not sure I agree with.
I mean, capitalism has done a huge amount of good for everybody. I mean, yes, there are still people living on the streets, and there's still people living in penthouses, but as a society, we are all better off. I have things in my flat right now, like this iPhone. Like even the richest man in the world would have had that 20 years ago, and that's something that all had greater access to as a result of capitalism and the free market. And I do believe in capitalism. I mean, I own businesses. I'm part of the capitalist model myself, but at the same time, and I think that hopefully the word I use most of all in this podcast is but not all of capitalism is good. There are some parts of it are extremely, extremely harmful, like cronyism, for example. And we've seen like Elon Musk right now. We've seen the results of the sort of things that happens if one man gets too much money and power, and the political influence and toxicity one man can generate as a result of capitalism. So I think we're talking about capitalism now, but I'd love to see us find ways of changing the incentives of capitalism. So it's not just about accumulating money or capital, but also about doing that in a way that's ethical and sustainable long term and doesn't lead to such a massive disparity of money. So yes and no. Yes and no is the answer to most of the questions I think we'll have today. There's some parts of capitalism I admire, some parts of it I don't. I like some capitalist models like Rhine capitalism in Germany, where it's free market but underpinned by a large sort of state. That's, I think, interesting. So, but in terms of capitalism, yeah, I mean, I looked at things like, for example, one of the popular sound bites of men and boys advocacy is men can cry. Why don't men cry anymore? Of course, I mean, it's quite surface level, not that interesting, but we're there now. And interestingly, historically speaking, men did cry. Men crying was seen not as something to be celebrated, as a sign of masculinity, as a sign of heroism and manliness. Throughout, there's stories of samurais crying, there's stories of knights crying. There's Iliad, all the soldiers broke down and cried. And then it all changed. It all changed during the Industrial Revolution in the UK. So when capitalism arrived, and a lot of people I think Tom Waltz wrote The History of Tears or something like that, and he said that's what happened, and it's basically down to the fact that there's no time to cry. If you're a man working in a factory 12 hours a day, you haven't got time to cry. So keep your tears and emotions to yourself. Stop talking. Get to work. That's an interesting theory. I think that's an example of the damage capitalism can do and has done to men. But I don't know. I wouldn't say it's been less damaging to women. I don't know. I mean, capitalism has done a lot of good for women as well. I mean, if you talk about the pill, reproductive, and like even like white goods, that have liberated women from their traditional domestic duties, no longer have to educate, feed, clothe, cook everything from scratch with 7 children. They're supported by these various different domestic goods, and they've given a lot more reproductive control by the pill and the condoms and that sort of thing. So these are all results of capitalism too that have liberated women. And I would say that these things have liberated women more than any feminist. The pill, for example, has done more for women, I think, than any feminist. And that was by capitalism and by men. So it's very complicated.
Yeah, I mean, also you've got a lot of women just going into different workplaces that would have been impossible decades ago.
Yeah.
You've got
women are 40% of all breadwinners in America now. That's obviously not 50%. I think it probably could be 50%, but it was more than 5%. It was in the 1960s, or maybe less than that. So, yeah, we're moving in the right direction in a lot of ways. Still work to be done, but it's not as dramatic or as pessimistic as a lot of people like to present it as. And that goes back to the whole oppression thing, the whole victimhood thing. And I'm not a big fan of that either, to be honest.
I think it's people falling victim to kind of black and white thinking things are so simplistic that it's either women are suffering and men aren't, or the opposite. And it's so much more complicated than that.
And just being unable to have a conversation with people with whom you disagree. I had a conversation about this very thing, about capitalism and then the damage it's done. And I agreed with a lot of things he said. And I was like, but do you understand what existed before capitalism? So feudalism. And that was horrendous. So there's good and bad. And the answer is not communism. That's similarly flawed. Or socialism, same thing. But the guy I was trying to talk, he just literally is so offended by just the idea that capitalism could have had some positive impact to society. He literally walked off. He stood up and then walked off mid-conversation. And I'm like, okay, you're not able to have this conversation. You've not got the skin for it. You're too thin-skinned. and that's a problem too.
I think the answer when people say like communism's answer, socialism's answer is that black and white thinking. It's just thinking, well, this isn't working now. There's problems that we have now, so let's just burn it all to the ground and start again. And that's just like we need to think in more complex and grey ways in which we can maybe almost inject better, ethical, and fairer policies into capitalism rather than just getting rid of capitalism first.
You're throwing the baby out of the bathwater.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're ignoring the fact that capitalism has, in my opinion, still done net positive to society, broadly speaking. And there was some bits of it that are worth keeping and some bits of it that are worth changing. And I also like what comes next. And it's probably the wrong podcast to talk about it, but I'm very interested in techno-feudalism, which is emerging now, which is essentially a reassimilation of what came before capitalism. So I said feudalism. I mean, cut this out of the podcast. This might be irrelevant to your viewers. But basically, obviously, before capitalism, feudalism existed. Feudalism is where lords and ladies own parts of the land, and then people work on the land for free, turning the land to serfs. And you basically exist on the land of a powerful lord. And that's it. That's it. You work there, and that's your life. You live there, you work there. That's it. Capitalism came along, changed everything. Free market arrived. Now, techno-feudalism is what's happening now, where it's the return of the feudal lords, but from a technological point of view. So the feudal lords are essentially people like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, as mentioned, Mark Zuckerberg, and even more broadly, things like the App Store, Spotify, these large feudal lords through which we now work. So you don't necessarily sell your product directly to the end customer. You have to work through Amazon Marketplace, or you have to go through the App Store, you have to go through Spotify, or Deliveroo, Uber Eats, whatever. Restaurants don't get to work on a free market model directly with customers. They have to go through the techno-feudal lords. And if Jeff Bezos doesn't like your product, he will just turn it off, and that's it. So it's the same as the feudal lords of yesteryear, but instead of getting thrown off the land, you're being thrown out of their online marketplace. And I think that's an interesting conversation as well.
Well, that's literally what we're doing now. This is going to get uploaded to YouTube. I have to go through YouTube. I have to go through Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We're actually doing that now.
Well, if the feudal lord at the top of YouTube doesn't like what you've got to say, which often is true for me, they'll just turn you off.
Yeah. I mean, talking about these like the richest people in the world, you're talking like your Elon Musks and your Mark Zuckerbergs and your Jeff Bezoses. I've heard this point made ad nauseum, but it's still worth mentioning when people use these figures as to make their point that men own the majority of wealth or that men are the most powerful. They're using 0.00001% of men to make this point. And it just can't be used for the majority of men.
No, yeah. And also there's loads of ways in which women have a lot of power, like financial power. Like women control 85% of money spent. So they're the ones that are controlling the market. And I guess that's in the capitalist world. If you control the market, you control capitalism. And if women are 85% of all consumer spending, there's power in that too. Not to mention they also have 40% of the wealth. And yeah, it's true that 90% of billionaires are men, but it's also true that only a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of 1% of men are billionaires. So if you're 10 times more likely to be a billionaire as a man, which is true, that only means that your chance of being a billionaire goes from 0.0000001% to 0.0000002%. So I don't want to quibble over that tiny percentage difference. I've always thought about that a bit like comparing the size of a grain of rice to a grain of sand. It's like, yeah, one of those is 10 times bigger, but they're both fucking small. So let's put down the sand and the rice, and let's talk about things that are actually relevant to everybody. So I'll talk about men's health, life expectancy, education, things that impact everyone, because we all go through education and we all have health issues. And when you look at education, which is way more relevant to men than billionaire Elon Musk's, you see men and boys behind at every stage of education in every single Western country, more or less, and behind in every single one of the leading causes of death. So top 15 causes of death in America, men lead in 13 of them. That is such a much more important metric to gender equality than who's got the most billionaires. It doesn't, and I guess that's where I'm trying to position myself.
I think the problem is like a lot of people use words like oppression as their kind of virtue signaling when they talk about these small percentages of men. And if you really cared about oppression or suffering, you wouldn't really care about the fact that women can't like women, there aren't as many women billionaires, you would really start talking about who the people are actually suffering, the vast majority of men and women, and start solving that issue rather than trying to solve inequalities at the top of the
Yeah.
rich list.
I mean, you're a lot more likely to become a homeless man than you are a male billionaire, unfortunately, guys. Same for women too, of course. So I'd rather us look down at, people, men and women both living in misery, poverty, distress. There's so many things at the bottom: addiction, suicide, deaths of despair, like poverty, crime. All of it is linked to lower socioeconomic sort of well-being. None of it seems to be discussed. We're just constantly shaking our fists at the sky. I hate Elon Musk as much as anyone, but he's not symptomatic of every man. He is one man. And I think that's where a lot of men are being frustrated, being judged by the lives of a tiny, tiny percentage of hyper successful men with whom we have nothing in common with. I mean,
Why?
go on.
I was just going to say, why do you think the left failed so massively? Say the U.S. election, they lost a lot of young men to the right. Why do you think? Is it just because they failed to mention any policies regarding men's issues? A lot of people are citing the fact that Kamala Harris wasn't on the Joe Rogan podcast as the reason. What do you think? What do you think they've done so wrong?
Well, I mean, Kamala Harris. It's not about not going on Joe Rogan podcast. That's more symptomatic of her not understanding half of her voters whom are men, and not understanding, not caring, seemingly not wanting to talk about the various issues that are devastating American men's lives, and just thinking they're not as important as the issues that devastate women's lives. And she put her flag very much in the ground of the women's rights issues and of other minorities. Women aren't even a minority, but a minority, and totally ignored 50% of voters. So if your strategy to get elected is to immediately ignore 50% of those who could vote for you, I don't think you can be surprised when you lose that election. And yeah, I'll happily say them again. Like 13 of the top 15 causes of death led by men. Men are 1.4 times more likely to die than women in America. Men and boys are more likely to die in every age group in America. They're behind at every stage of education in America. They die, thousands and thousands of men, 4,500 men die every year at work in America. Fathers deprived of children all over America every single day. These men are crying out for help, political change. Kamala Harris, who potentially could have done that for them, she chose not to. She chose to instead mock and insult them, and then she didn't get voted for. Like, what part of that is surprising to anybody?
But then people cried sexism when people didn't vote for her.
No, they've polled that already. I remember, I think it's right back to 2010. They asked Americans, are you supportive of a female candidate for president? And I think like 95% of people said yeah, maybe 90%. That was in 2010. So that's 15 years ago. And I imagine that's gone even higher to the point where it's more or less everyone. I mean, it's not the same in the UK, but we've just, obviously, the Conservatives just elected Kemi Badenoch as the leader of the Conservative Party, who's a black woman. So, I mean, I don't think we're that against it. And I feel like that's not, I'm sure there are some people who would not want a woman as president, but by far, in my opinion, the biggest cause of Kamala's loss, from what I can see, is her just neglecting 50% of her voters. Some of them might be misogynists, but the vast majority won't be. And they didn't vote for her for good reason. I mean, I wouldn't have voted. I probably would have voted for Kamala still, only because the alternative is so horrifying to me. As much as I enjoy the entertainment factor of waking up every day to whatever hell President Trump has tweeted, I would rather not have him as president. So, but I wouldn't have voted for Kamala enthusiastically at all.
I think what worries me about this is the kind of aftermath is that the Democrats aren't even questioning why they lost, or even like wanting to look at themselves in the mirror. So they're just blaming blaming men for moving further right. They're blaming men for voting for someone like Trump. They're blaming men for watching people like Andrew Tate. But it's like, of course, these people are problematic, and that's not great. But you're pushing them towards that because they're the only ones that are actually saying anything about them.
These people, they're just infatuated with themselves, the left. They've painted themselves as the hero of their own story, and they're not. there's accountability to be had on all sides. It's so frustrating that the people that speak so often of accountability take none for themselves, and the people that are dishing out these tough to swallow pills, which are useful, they don't take the pill. They spit the pills out when they're given back to them, and men have been failed by the left. Absolutely, men and boys have both been failed. Just imagine, like, just think about America. 1/4 of all boys growing up in America have no dad at home. 80% of those boys then go to school, and there were no men in their classrooms either. They turn on the TV, they're seeing like horrendous portrayals of men as doofus dads and clowns, inept fathers, all of the classic sitcom, Homer Simpson, Peter Griffin, etc., etc. There's nothing there for them. They go on social media, they see it as toxic masculinity, male privilege, male fragility, the patriarchy, male oppression, like, okay, nothing there for me. And then someone like Andrew Tate comes along, or Donald Trump to a lesser extent, but Andrew Tate comes along and he speaks positively about masculinity, not in the way I'd want him to, and for motivations that I think are sort of selfish. I think he just wants to exploit men, but he's still speaking positively about masculinity. And even his half-hearted, incomplete version of that is so tremendously successful at attracting all these disenfranchised, nomadic boys and men that he became the fastest growing influence of all time. So that is symptomatic of how much we failed. That is directly indicating of how big our failure is. If he's the most successful influencer of all time, that just shows how much we failed boys and men, and how much more we can do for them, and haven't in the subsequent years since then, to be honest.
What can you think of any positive role models for boys on the left, and also maybe for the right, that are actually giving something positive to boys?
No.
Wow.
I mean, there's definitely men who are doing good work, but I don't think they're doing it. I mean, my biggest hero ever, Stephen Fry, followed by Christopher Hitchens. That's my 1-2 double act. They're brilliant. I would say they're both on the left. Stephen Fry definitely is on the left, but he's a role model for boys, but he's not a role model of. He doesn't speak about men, but he's just a lovely, wonderful man. He's amazing, but he doesn't speak about boys and men, and I would love to see him do that. But in terms of specifically on the left, talking specifically about boys in a positive way, and even more so talking about masculinity in a positive way, I don't know. I mean, I sat on a panel a few weeks ago about male suicide, and then a father told me, he asked a question about how he's desperately trying to find his child. He's divorced. The mother of his child took the child away. He has no idea where the child is. He's been trying to find out, where's my kid? I'm scared for him. I don't know where he's basically been kidnapped. Doesn't know where he is. And then the next question was a woman that asked me that your exact question: where do we find these role models then? Whom is taking away these role models? And I'm like, the guy before you sat literally to your left. He just told you he's lost his child in family courts unfairly, and he's desperately trying to be the role model for his boy. And there was no better role model than a father. And he can't. When I talk about role models for the left, I don't mean like some influencer. I mean fathers, I mean teachers, I mean men, like boxing gym people, like people that can actually work with boys in real life, not through social media. Just people, men in classrooms, men at home, sports coaches, whatever. I don't know where they are. So no, I don't know. I mean, there aren't enough fathers in homes, there aren't enough men in classrooms, so I haven't got an answer for you, I'm afraid.
Well, you've mentioned classrooms. I've got here a quote, because I just happened to be watching Chris Williamson yesterday, and it was the best of his 2024 episodes, which I'm sure you're on there.
Okay, wow. I hope so.
I would hope.
I mean, I would put him as a role model, but I wouldn't consider him on the left. I think he's a role model to a lot of men and boys, including myself. So, big up, Chris.
Yeah. This is a quote from his conversation with Brett Weinstein. So he asked Brett, "Have you seen the data showing the movement of teenage boys politically to the right?" And he said, "I've watched them," meaning his teenage boys, "be pushed farther and farther right by their schools. You suck. All your instincts are bad. These girls are amazing. Look at you. You're pathetic. Be less masculine and more attractive. You're just barking at them constantly. They're not moving right. They're moving out of your stupid way."
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I actually couldn't have written that better myself, and I might have to plagiarize that. Yeah. It's just our failure of boys. It's not boys going anywhere. We've left them behind. in our discussion of compassionate political discourse, and have instead decided to cast men and boys as the villain of everything. Like men, men as a group are literally blamed for everything, to the point where we've named everything bad in the world after men, the patriarchy, and now we're blaming everything in the world for everyone and for all of time on men. I don't understand that. That is not a useful foundation. It's complete bullshit, first of all, and it's just not a kind thing to say to anyone, including women, but most of all men. Who wants to be part of that? No one, no one. And yet the left, who keep pushing these ideological, deeply divisive ideas, don't seem to understand they're the ones that are failing, and they're failing in a massive way that's only harming themselves in a way we've discussed. But yeah, I mean, it's getting earlier and earlier and earlier. A lot of boys in the UK, I think something like 25% of boys in the UK in school, we're talking about 10 to 12-year-old boys, they've already been told in school that men are problematic to society. That is not the sort of thing you should be learning in school. A lot of boys are going to toxic masculinity workshops in school. I read a story about boys who were forced to stand up in assembly and apologise to the girls in assembly. For what? For what? For sexual violence, apparently. These are boys. They go home and their parents are horrified. I don't think parents appreciate that. I was sent a letter from a parent not long ago, and it was basically a workshop for boys at her primary school, and the boys were told they had to go to the workshop, couldn't opt out of it, and it was all about encouraging healthy masculinity for boys, and reducing sexual violence by boys onto girls. And again, these are 10-year-old fucking boys. And that's not to say I don't think there should be talk about consent in school, but the girls need to be in those lessons too. There's so many, lots of data says that boys are more likely to experience sexual assault in school by girls than girls are by boys. I don't see any training for them, and I wouldn't want them to be branded as toxic or whatever else nonsense we brand boys as, but I'd like to have a grown-up, evidence-based, inclusive conversation about sexual violence in school that is reasonable, doesn't lean so heavily into these childish cartoon views of the world that are more deserving of like a conspiracy theory than an actual meaningful discourse. So yes and no, as always.
Yeah, I think the problem in schools is you've got so many boys being told that they're the problem, that they have to apologise for sexual assault, and they're not getting any reasonable conversations around sex and around consent. That I'm sure there definitely are schools, I'm sure, that are providing that reasonable discussion for boys, but a lot of them are not. And then the boys get to go home, they've got complete unrestricted access on their phone, and then they watch probably quite a lot of problematic content online surrounding sex. You've got porn, you've got people discussing sexual violence and stuff online that just isn't very helpful. So they're getting such conflicting messages from the content they view and from their schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's only one direction. It only ever paints them as predators and never as victims in their own right. Never as victims. I mean, my earliest lesson of consent was not in a school. It was being forced to kiss elderly members of my family by my parents. When I was like literally, I don't know how old I was, maybe 3 or 4. No, I don't want to kiss Granny. No, I do not want to kiss Uncle, whoever the fuck he is. But you have to do it nonetheless. So like straight away, at the earliest possible age, the people most important to me, being my parents, are just completely taking away my consent as a child. And one of the lessons I would love to teach kids that you do not have to kiss anyone, including family or friends. It doesn't matter if your parents telling you to do it. You do not have to do anything you don't want to do. And I would encourage parents to learn that lesson most of all. And that is a useful lesson, boys and girls, that parents can be teaching. That's just one lesson. And I feel like that lesson just on its own would have more use than all of these bullshit, toxic masculinity, anti-male violence workshops that are just being rolled out into schools and only ever look at the issue in one single way.
Do you think the Me Too movement accelerated these issues for boys?
I mean, yes, yes and no.
Yes and no.
I mean, it's an important lesson to learn. I think, like men being put under the magnifying glass of scrutiny by mostly women, but society as a whole, has been useful in some ways. I feel like men are doing better. I feel like I've learned lessons for sure. I think most men have, and I appreciate those lessons. But it does need to be toned down a little bit in areas, and we do need to acknowledge it goes both ways. We do need to acknowledge there are good men, and we do need to acknowledge there are bad women. But that's not to say some of the lessons from Me Too weren't useful. for everyone, and the conversations were needed and were bound to happen. But it's just fucking doesn't go both ways. Like, think about what's her name, Rose McGowan, who started off the Me Too movement more or less with her allegations. Very important what she did. But then, when the allegations were made against her friend Asia Argento, who allegedly raped a minor, a boy, raped him. When that magnifying glass of scrutiny came onto Rose McGowan's friend Asia, suddenly Rose is like, "Everyone, calm down. We don't know the full truth. We don't know what's going on here," which I understand, but that is just a double standard. And then Asia Argento quietly paid off, I think maybe $30,000, this poor boy, and nothing was said or done about it. Meanwhile, Harvey Weinstein, quite rightly dragged through the mud, slung into prison. Good, but there's more to it than that. There always is. And it's interesting how people like Rose, in a very literal way, can be condemning of men, but then when her own friend, who's a woman, is accused of the same thing, the narrative seems to change, and suddenly she's got a lot more compassionate.
Mm. What are some of the myths around sexual assault that you've seen?
Loads. I mean, where do we start? I think one of the things which sexual violence characterised that really harms women, a lot of the narrative is that sexual violence happens to women, at bus stops or whilst walking home from work, or at train stations and stuff like that, and it does happen there. But you're far more likely to experience sexual violence at the hands of someone behind closed doors at home. So these ideas of like bears in forests and all these stupid thought experiments that position the conversation of sexual violence outside the home, I feel like they're doing a disservice to women, because the biggest threat to people, including men, I think for men it's in the streets, but for women the biggest threat is at home. So it's not bears in the forest you need to worry about, it's the people that at home. As for men, of course, so the myths are even more prominent, more problematic, I'd say, and that's that men can't be abused, men can't be raped, men are only ever the perpetrators of sexual violence. And if they experience sexual violence, it's not as harmful, they deserve it, it's self-defense, blah, 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 all of that's bullshit. It's like a serious problem. And it's not funny at all. The sad thing about these myths, like, people say 99% of rapists are men. The sad thing about that is it's actually true, but it's true because it's misleading. It's misleading because in the UK, for example, a woman can't perpetrate rape. So nothing that a woman does to a man will ever be rape. My friend who woke up to find a woman having sex with him in the middle of the night, he was not raped. That was not rape. The same friend who happened again a few years later, that was not rape either. That's because in the UK, by law and academically speaking, you have to have a penis, and it has to be penetration by a penis. Anything other than that is not rape. So when people say 99% of rapists are men, that's only because women cannot perpetrate rape in the UK, at least. So if you actually look at men who are raped by women, by broadening that definition to include men who are made to penetrate, it's called in America, very different. About 30 to 40% of rape victims are men, and about 80% of the people doing it to men are women. So a lot being missed out there, and we need to, again, expand these very gendered definitions of rape to include anyone who experiences unconsenting sex, not just those with a penis or without a penis. And that, again, very antithetical to our plight for gender neutral language, which I'm on board with that. I think, firefighters, police officers, but we need to also explore the highly gendered narratives around sexual violence, especially in the legal system, especially the law, that wholesale exclude women as perpetrators and men as victims. That's got to be part of the movement as well.
Yeah, I mean, you see these issues so succinctly in various campaigns. Like here in Edinburgh, we had a campaign Edinburgh Council put on called "Give Her Space." It was a TV advert, and it had all these various scenarios of women in public spaces. So right there, you're already, you're almost, the message is that women are going to be sexually assaulted in public spaces, which does happen, of course. But you're not. There wasn't anything to do with sexual assault in the home, and it was always a man being inappropriate to a woman in all of the cases. And it just, I can't remember the last time I've seen an Edinburgh Council campaign, and I think that's the only one I've ever seen, and that's how they choose to do it.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at, obviously, like I said, 30 to 40% of rape victims are men. Men are obviously a minority of sexual violence victims, but they're still a significant minority. And there obviously has to be discussion of women too, as there is, but Even if it's just one man being sexually assaulted in Edinburgh, I think he deserves to be visible too. That's again, that blows my mind how feminism is made great. One of the things I enjoyed about feminism most of all is how it doesn't matter how small a minority you are. It doesn't matter if you're just, one single intersex person, intersex, making up 0.5% of the population. You are still important to feminism. You still deserve, a day a year, awareness, visibility, and I love that. But then men who are raped by women make up a significantly larger percentage of society than intersex people who have their own day. These men get nothing. In fact, they are mocked, minimized, laughed upon, like diminished, ignored, completely betrayed. And what happened to no one left behind? What happened to that? And I don't know what happened to that. I guess it was politically inconvenient for them because it would require some sort of accountability on their behalf.
Yeah, and it's just going back to this like simplistic thinking, because even in that advert, it was always a man inappropriately communicating with a woman, and it wasn't ever man communicating to man. It wasn't ever women communicating to man. It wasn't ever any sort of trans person. It was only women, men to women, straight kind of.
Or women to women. Like,
Yeah, of course,
the
yeah.
women, like the same antiquated laws in the UK that erase male rape victims by women, those same laws, they also erase women that rape other women. Like the same, more broadly, about domestic violence models, they are also gendered, where they often diminish or erase entirely male victims and female perpetrators for the same gendered language. And they harm women too. Women in same-sex relationships experience very high cases of intimate partner violence. Often the highest rates are gay women. They're completely erased by the same thinking as was what we're talking about. So it's not just men that's suffering, it's women, and yeah, like you said, like everyone, like lots of people are being hurt. It's not just about men.
Yeah. Talk to me about why the statement "not all men" is so controversial.
Well, I obviously like to say that. I mean, it's not all men. Yeah, it's again, it's the one-sided narrative once more, where yes, we can talk about men. You have every right to be angry at a man who's harmed you and to hate that man as an individual, but nothing gives you the right to hate all men. Nothing entitles you to class hatred against men. And by just hating men, you're just alienating allies, such as myself, and most men, I'd say, are probably offended by being compared to a rapist. And you're harming yourself. You're dividing your support in half. You're blaming men that have done nothing wrong. And most ironically, the actual man that has harmed you, he's not mentioned at all. We're just too busy talking about men as this abstract term. Of course, it goes without saying that it's not all men. The percentage of men who are arrested in America every year for violent crime is 0.2%. And yes, you could say, obviously that's only arrests. That could be 10 times higher if it includes all instances, but it's still 2%. Like, still, the vast majority of men are good, kind, wonderful people, just like the vast majority of women are. And you do not get to define an entire group by their absolute very worst members. Otherwise, I'd be using Lucy Letby, etc., as an archetype for women. And I hate it. I hate how many people on the men's side, the men's health coaches, just these grifters that are just trying to define men by their very worst. I know some people talk about like school shooters, and as if that is symptomatic of men, because obviously most school shooters are boys, although recently that's not true, but it is mostly boys. And people are like, this is fundamentally about masculinity, to quote Jackson Katz, and it's not. It's just not, because again, like billionaires, school shooters are even smaller percentage of men. And for Jackson Katz to say school shooters is fundamentally about masculinity because it's mostly men doing it is like so unfair. It's a bit like someone that's trying to measure room temperature, going to the top of a volcano and then throwing the thermometer into the volcano and saying that's room temperature. And it's not. Like, the actions of school shooters are tiny minority of people, thankfully, and they're not doing it because they're boys or men. They're doing it because they're deeply unwell, troubled individuals that are deserving of help and, dare I say it, sympathy to understand what they've gone through, often from fatherless homes where they've got no male role model. And the problem is not masculinity. The problem is a lack of masculinity, positive male role models in that boy's life. And like the correlation between fatherlessness and school shooters is stark. And I think that suggests the problem is not masculinity, but perhaps it's the opposite. And I don't appreciate people like Jackson Katz labeling men as school shooters just because of a tiny percentage. And like I said, I would say neonaticide, which is the killing of babies in the first years of life, that is almost 100% done by women. Almost 100% of people that kill babies are women. That's horrible. I do not then get to take that and, like school shooters, say this is fundamentally about femininity, because that would just make me as bigoted as Jackson Katz and unhelpful. And I just hate these people like him and others who masquerade as being kind, thoughtful men, but in reality, I just think they're horrible, malevolent, narrow-minded bigots, bullies who are just trying to contort men into something they're not and erase all the great things men have done, quite literally saving lives. But one of the ways, I mean, I'll just give you one more example. It's like 9/11, for example, it's probably the biggest cultural movement, biggest cultural moment in our lifetimes. Obviously, I think all 19 hijackers were men. We can absolutely talk about the dangers that men face in terrorism, like school shooters. But 344 firefighters ran into those Twin Towers on that same day, and they all died, and they were all men. 100% of the firefighters, so I should say firemen, who died on 9/11 in New York were men. And no one talks about male heroism. We're all very happy to talk about male violence, and we should. But there is also such thing as male heroism, and we also need to talk about the firefighters kicking down the doors, as well as the terrorists causing harm. And again, that's another incomplete storyline. So yeah, it's a yes and no once again.
I mean, you've got all these like amazing stories of what men have done, but even on the ordinary day-to-day experience, what I've started to notice, and I think part of it is the impact that your page has done, is that I just start to pay attention to the interactions I have with other men, just on a day-to-day, very ordinary, very normal conversations. One a bunch of experiences spring to mind, but one, me and my partner work in retail, so we're experiencing like a vast majority of like the public, and we're walking into work to start the day, and we're about to walk past a man who's shopping, and there's just a wee narrow part behind him that we need to get past, and he just kind of smiled and got out of the way, and that was literally it. And I can remember just walking past, just thinking that was really nice, like that's like, and then all these names that men call each other, like strangers. I'll have strangers calling me mate, strangers calling me boss, strangers calling me even sir, and it's just all of these conversations. They're such respectful, equal names for each other that we have. Yeah. And I just think I invite anyone just to, on the next day you're out in public, just start paying attention to what the men you see are doing, because you'll see men in construction, you'll see men taking your bins out, you'll see men just being very polite, and it kind of, I don't know, it reframes your view of the world. That's what men are.
Yeah, the men emptying the bins, the men keeping the lights on, the men out fishing, farming, stocking our cupboards and fridges, the men, dealing with sewage and water and electricity. They're not oppressing you. They're doing the opposite. They make your life amazing. Look at it. None of this is possible about men. None of it's possible about women either. And yet, the men who give everything, including their own lives, like I said, workplace deaths, it's almost entirely men. It's about 95% men who die at work in America. And we're talking thousands of men. We're talking more men dying at work every year in America than all of the military losses from the entire Iraq war over 20 years. So 4,500 to 5,000 men giving their lives to do these things. I don't remember us thanking the garbage man. I don't remember thanking the electricians or the fishermen. And we should, or we might thank them, but only as their role, never as men. Never like, you can't ignore how many men are doing these difficult, dangerous, difficult, dirty jobs. And we should say that's masculinity too. Again, another stat for you. I could not believe it, but 100,000 people die in the fishing industry every single year. 100,000, more than probably. They didn't disaggregate if that was men or women, but I would say it's almost entirely going to be men that are in the fishing industry. 100,000. Like that's just fishing. That's just fishing. Forget about lumber and electricity and other foods and stuff and farming, agriculture. 100,000 men probably dead every year to put a fish in the fridge, and that's the sacrifice they're making. And that's not to say women don't sacrifice. Of course they do. Of course they do. And we are talking about it. But men sacrifice too, and fathers.
I think this whole conversation we've been talking about like such specific issues that men face, and when I was preparing for this conversation, it got me thinking of all the men I've known who have suffered greatly. And even like the men I've known who have died, I've known two men to take their own lives. I've known one man to die by overdose, and I've known one man to die by murder. And I just think that just summarizes it so succinctly.
I mean, yeah. I mean, Scotland, I think Glasgow, obviously around the corner from you. That's like
Yeah.
the drug addict, wouldn't know how to classify it, but more drug deaths in Glasgow and alcohol, especially, than anywhere in Europe. So we're talking about deaths of despair there, where they're in the same vein as suicide. It's like a man who's not looking after himself, living in like a world of addiction. No one saves him; he dies. So yeah, it's a huge problem. I know everyone lauds appreciation on these very attractive masculinity influencers doing podcasts, but the men doing the real work are like those like my friend Dan, who runs a charity called Man Up, and he every week I think he goes down to London with a little microphone and a camera, and he just talks to normal men. He's like, "All right, mate, you've got 5 minutes. I'd love to talk to you," and he's doing that just for free. On the ground, just talking to normal men, not high profile, economically powerful celebrity men who really don't know much about masculinity or men's life experience whatsoever. Just normal men, working class men. One man is a construction worker. Construction workers are probably the most at-risk group to suicide in the UK. Never see them spoken about. And I was with him once doing these interviews in London. So if you go to Liverpool Street, you might see us there one day. And the thing that came across to me was every single man we spoke to was fucked in his own unique way. And totally unique, like unexpected. I was just like, wow, no man was like, yeah, I'm just here, counting my shares and off to the stock market. They were all like, oh, I'm lonely, I'm depressed, I'm isolated, my parents are dying, all I've got is my cat, my back's giving out, I'm a construction worker, I don't know what to do, I'm in debt. They're not living lives of privilege. I'm sure there's certain men that are, but most men are not, and they need to be desperately spoken about. And it is literally a matter of life and death. I think there's 800 suicides in the construction industry in the UK on its own. That's crazy. That is so staggeringly high.
That's how I usually think in terms of voting. I'll vote for who I think's the most vulnerable people in my country, and that happens to be, I think, in my country, and this has been the case for the last at least 10 years. Homeless, drug addicted, suicidal people, and that just happens to mean the majority is men, and we've not seen that spoken about nearly enough.
I feel a lot of people like you are a lot of people are in that boat, and they're sort of accidental advocates for men. Everyone says about, oh, men's rights is so hostile, so stupid. I'm like, okay, and then I'll talk to them about what they care about, and it'll be homelessness, suicide, addiction, mental health. And if you can talk about those things, you are still talking about men, because 80% of homeless people, 90% of homeless deaths, 77% of drug deaths, 80% of suicides are men. So you're accidentally talking about them. The difference is no one's linked them together. No one said what do all these issues have in common. What is the common denominator between drug addicts and suicide and all the other things? And I think it's disposability. I think we fundamentally see men's lives as more disposable than a woman's, and their lives and well-being less important than a woman's, and that's male disposability, and that's the missing piece. Like we talk about men's issues in a way that you talked about them, but we don't talk about them in like a unified way. We categorize them elsewhere. So like people that are pacifists, want to end war, you're men's advocates, because 99% of war deaths are men. Homelessness I talked about, and I just wish we would talk about them as a group to understand, to inform one another, because I feel like we're missing a lot of the picture there.
I'd love to at least attempt to end this conversation on a high. Is there anything you have optimism for in this space? The responses you've had from men, is there anything you're optimistic about?
Yeah, I mean, loads of it. I am an optimistic person. It's difficult to be optimistic, but there is optimism. Again, this is something I was talking to my girlfriend about. One of the things I've learned from feminism is that I don't want to become embroiled in this victimhood complex, this like pity party I'm constantly seeing. Woe is me. It's depressing. And some things are depressing. You can't get away from that. But I think we are moving in the right direction. I feel like, men's health we talked about. I guess that's one of the big issues. It's no better in the UK. Obviously, I would consider drug addiction a men's health issue. I'd consider suicide a men's health issue. I would consider experiences of abuse and sexual violence a men's health issue. And Wes Streeting, who is the Minister for Health in the UK, a few weeks ago was announced the first ever men's health strategy. So the government, to go alongside the women's health strategy, which we absolutely do need. We've never had a men's health strategy, and now we soon will do. So that's a real legislative change. That's one of many changes that needs to happen, but it's still happened, and that would not have happened a year ago or even 6 months ago. But it has happened now. I know one of the drums I've been beating is the drum of a minister for men, to add on to the strategy for men's health. I think we need a minister for men, again, to work alongside a minister for women, to talk about these issues. And the minister for men was a sort of a joke 5 years ago. When I set up my page, people would laugh at me for the idea of a minister for men. Ha 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 ha. Guess what? It's in the news. It's been discussed on daytime TV. They've done polls. About half the public now agree with me. And it would have been about 5% a few years ago. So maybe in another few years, we'll be tipping over and we'll have a minister for men too. And then once the ball's rolling, we're off. We're off to the races. So I think in the next few years, we can expect a fairly large tipping point. People like Chris Williamson, although doesn't talk in the same way as I do, he's shown that there's a massive appetite from women and men to have discussions around these sort of things. Andrew Tate's proven that in the wrong way, but there's a gap in the market, and people like myself, Chris, etc., and you are filling it, and that's a good sign. And I think just keep our heads down for a few more years, and it's going to look a lot different.
Well, I want to thank you, one, for taking the time just to speak to me, but two, for your page. I mean, if you looked on my Instagram page, on the algorithm, yours is always one of the first stories there. Yours is always one of the first posts there. It just shows that I really appreciate what you're doing. I think it's incredible. Thank you. I know that you'll experience backlash. I mean, I've experienced small numbers of kind of negative comments online. I know you'll experience way more, and it's no small feat what you do. So I appreciate it.
The backlash for me, it comes in waves. It's an odd phenomenon, the backlash. There is a backlash, of course, but generally I don't get any backlash. Generally speaking, on a normal day, I'll get no negative messages, but I'll get a dozen messages saying thank you, I love your page. It's really helped me understand my child or my dad or whatever. That's the message I receive most of all. But every now and again you'll get an influx of backlash, and it's always the same people, always come from the same place, always saying the same thing. So I think it's more an orchestrated backlash from people behind the scenes, just basically brigading you. And I know who they are, and I don't care. So I've got no time for it. I'll just ignore you and maybe block you. I don't care. But overall, I'm inundated with positive messages, kind messages of support, such as the one you've just given me. Thank you. And the backlash, I think, is overstated. I think a lot of people are a lot more willing to have these conversations than you think, and more so than ever. And again, like you said, in a year's time more so, and then a year after that more so. And times are changing. The backlash is over. I think there's still going to be arseholes that are trying to bring you down. But that's just life. That is just life. Yeah. So just ignore them and keep doing what you think is right.
Well, thank you. Hopefully we can do another conversation in a year and see how far we've come in a year.
Yeah, I'd love to. This could be the start of every year. This could be our thing.
Exactly, yeah.
We'll check back, see if my predictions are right.
Yes, exactly, yeah. Hi guys, just a few more things before you take off. Firstly, thank you so much for watching. It genuinely means a lot to see people watching and liking the content. Second, if you're enjoying the content, please subscribe to the channel. That's the best way you can support the podcast. As you can probably tell, I don't have a team behind me helping with recording or editing the podcast, and I certainly don't have a lot of fancy equipment, so any help or support is greatly appreciated because it will help the podcast grow and get better. And finally, keep on struggling.